education experts unanimously predicting a drop in the overall pass rate for the class of 2021. Last year's matriculants were in grade 11 in 2020 when the academic year was severely disrupted due to COVID-19. In 2020, the overall matric pass rate was 76.2%. That figure is expected to fall by almost 10% when matrics receive their results this week. Let's unpack the story for you now. Professor Chika Sehoole is the Dean of University of Pretoria's Education Faculty. He joins us now for some analysis on this. Prof, it's great to have you with us on the program, albeit on such a, it's a heartbreaking story, but perhaps not entirely unexpected. Are you shocked by this prediction of a 10% drop?
I'm not shocked at all, and actually I'm one of those people who are expecting that sharp drop. And the question is, why are we expecting this drop? As you rightly said in your introduction, we need to keep in mind what we have been through over the last 2 years. In March 2020, we had a national lockdown under lockdown level 5, where all schools or all education institutions were closed. And these learners at the time were in grade 11, and the schools were closed for almost 3.5 months. They returned to school around late July. Upon return, there was a rotation system or a staggered attendance, which was introduced in compliance with the COVID protocols, especially in relation to social distancing. Now, during that particular period, there was a lot of time on learning that was lost. And in rural areas, and especially in impoverished areas, these learners who were in grade 11 came to school 3 times a week. And there were also disruptions after they came back to schools as a result of cluster outbreaks of COVID cases in schools. And another point that needs to be remembered is the fact that at the time, teachers who had comorbidities were also not coming to work. They were allowed to stay at home. So these are the interruptions which these learners unfortunately had to go through, and there was a lot of loss of learning that took place. And obviously, when it got into grade 12 last year, there was a lot of knowledge gap which had to be dealt with. And of course, we commend the Department of Education in putting in place catch-up programs. However, those catch-up programs they could not deal with all the elements of the knowledge gap that these learners brought into grade 12.
Yeah,
and as a result of that, that's why we believe that there's going to be some drop in the pass rate this year.
Absolutely. I mean, the matric class that we're talking about, this was the class of grade 11 in 2020. They lost almost half of the school year in what is an incredibly important grade insofar as preparing for the matric year is concerned. And once again, Prof, it's going to be the poorer schools that will form the bulk of this drop in the matric class rate. Because schools in more affluent areas, they were able to keep on with teaching and learning during that time in 2020 and even throughout 2021. They had the option of online learning and online resources. You know, how do we, again, Prof, and we've had this discussion over and over again, how do we begin to bridge that gap?
Well, it's something which only government can deal with, but also government in partnership with parents and communities. It's unfortunate that when COVID befell us as a country, and this was not just a South African problem, it was a global problem. In our context, there were a lot of inequalities in terms of the resourcing of schools that led to a situation which you have just described. And I think it is upon government to come with a plan of addressing and redressing some of these inequalities so that come next 50 years, in the event that we have a situation like the one which we faced 2 years ago and it's actually still ongoing, we don't have to be dealing with the kind of challenges which we had to deal with in the last 2 years. But secondly, government alone cannot solve those problems. I think parents should come on board to assist government in terms of the teaching and learning of our
But how would that be possible, Prof?
Communities should also come on board in order to assist So education is not just a government responsibility, it's a core governance issue which involves all the stakeholders. But I also want to indicate that as we think about long-term solutions, the issue of resources cannot be overlooked. And resources do come from government, but the private sector should also come into the party to assist in addressing some of the social ills of our society.
Yeah, I mean, Prof, you know, when we talk about how over the years we try to deal with these kinds of challenges, particularly in our education sector, one just wonders whether the right decisions are being made, even as we go into this new school year. For example, the issue of rotational learning now being back on the table. And again, more affluent schools are not implementing rotational learning. They are there Monday to Friday. Those kids are not falling behind. Again, it's poorer schools and the children in those schools that will suffer from rotational learning.
Yeah, you are correct, but we also need to understand the context and the background and context in which rotational attendance of schools was introduced. It was government's attempt to mitigate against the spread of the coronavirus. And as you know, and this has been a debate over the last last 2 years, in terms of the conundrum which the government faced in terms of the choice between health and lives. And government took the option of saving lives, and this rotational system was introduced in an effort to save lives. And it's unfortunate that we find ourselves in a situation where those that are privileged are able to continue with teaching and learning, and the poor communities are the ones who are bearing the brunt of the rotational system. And the question is, if at all rotational system is effective, and I do believe that it was effective at that time, but maybe government needs to think about lifting the rotation system now that, you know, we have got the low levels of infections, and Omicron is not as devastating and lethal as the other two viruses which we were faced with.
Professor Chika Sehoole, let me thank you for your time this morning on the AM Report. University of Pretoria Education Faculty Dean. Some really difficult predictions made for the class of 2021, a drop in the matric pass rate predicted of up to 10%.